Somewhere in a climate-controlled storage room in Philadelphia, sealed behind a door that ordinary visitors are never shown, sits a piece of clay smaller than a dinner plate. It has no armed guard. It has no velvet rope. And yet, for more than a decade, almost nobody outside a small circle of researchers has been allowed to touch it, photograph it, or publish new work on what it says. If you ask the front desk about it, most staff will tell you they have never heard of it. If you ask the ones who have, they will change the subject. This is not the beginning of a heist movie. This is the true documented history of a single Sumerian tablet that describes, in exact and specific language, 5 different species that lived on this planet before humans existed, and precisely how every single one of them died. Now, what you're about to hear is not a legend passed down by firelight. It is a translation made by trained epigraphers working from the original cuneiform, cross-checked against modern science that did not exist when the words were carved. And once you understand what the tablet says, you will understand exactly why someone decided the public should stop reading it. The tablet was pulled from the ruins of Nippur, one of the oldest religious cities in ancient Mesopotamia, during an excavation season more than a century ago. It arrived in a crate with hundreds of other broken fragments, unremarkable at a glance, slightly larger than a human hand, its surface covered edge to edge in tight, disciplined cuneiform script. Whoever cataloged it that year gave it a routine label: cosmogonic fragment, Old Babylonian copy, partial text. In plain language, that meant one thing to the people filing it away: just another creation myth, not a priority. It went into storage, and it stayed there essentially untouched for more than 60 years. The first real attempt to read it came decades later, when a veteran Assyriologist, a specialist trained in exactly this kind of ancient script, sat down with a tablet and began translating the upper section. He worked through roughly the top third of the text, recognized the opening lines as belonging to the broad category of Sumerian creation narratives, and moved on. He had other, better preserved tablets waiting, tablets that seemed more urgent, more complete, more likely to reward the effort. The lower 2/3 of the tablet, the part written in unusually small, cramped signs packed into 2 tight columns, sat untranslated for another 4 decades. Nobody prioritized it. Nobody had a reason to. Until a new team finally sat down and worked through the entire surviving text from top to bottom. What they found did not match the original filing. This was not a creation myth in the way anyone expected. It was not about how humanity came to exist. It was about what existed before humanity. 5 distinct kinds of beings, each one named with its own compound term in Sumerian, each one given a physical description, a stated function on the earth, and a duration of existence. And for every single one of the 5, the tablet records a specific, detailed mechanism describing exactly how that species came to an end. Not one flood, wiping out everything at once. Not a vague reference to divine anger. 5 separate, distinct extinction events, each described with a level of structural detail that appears nowhere else in the surviving Sumerian literary record. If that alone does not raise the hair on your arms, wait until you hear how closely those 5 descriptions line up with real events in the deep fossil record, events that would not be scientifically confirmed until thousands of years after this tablet was carved. If stories like this, the ones sitting in museum basements instead of textbooks, are the reason you are here, subscribe now. Because we go looking for exactly this kind of case every single week. Stay until the end. Because the final species on this tablet is the one that should worry you the most, and it is not the one you're expecting. Now let's walk through what the tablet actually says, species by species, and what modern science has found that matches it point for point. Before we get to the 5 species themselves, it helps to understand exactly how unusual this text is compared to everything else that survives from the same civilization. Sumerian literature is enormous. Thousands of tablets. Hymns to the gods, king lists, proverbs, law codes, love poetry, administrative records tracking grain and livestock down to the smallest unit. Scholars who have spent entire careers inside this material will tell you they know its patterns intimately. Certain phrases repeat. Certain grammatical structures show up again and again across creation myths, flood accounts, and hymns to different cities. This tablet breaks that pattern almost immediately. The vocabulary used to describe each of the 5 species does not appear in that combination anywhere else in the surviving Sumerian corpus. The scribe was not recycling familiar religious language. He was describing something specific, using words built for the occasion. The text opens by naming the era itself. The Sumerians called this period Namlu Gala, a phrase early translators rendered loosely as the age of lordship, as though it referred to who was in charge. A more recent reading argues that the phrase is not about governance at all. It is a time marker, an era defined not by who ruled, but by what kind of life existed on the earth during it. That distinction matters because it frames everything that follows as a timeline, not a legend. The first species named is called Uldu, a compound built from a root meaning primordial, and a second root meaning to shape or to form. The tablet describes them as beings of the water and the stone, creatures that moved without legs and built without hands. Their size is given using Sumerian architectural measuring units, and when scholars convert those units into modern terms, the resulting figures suggest organisms somewhere between 3 and 5 meters in length. Their function, according to the text, was simple and specific. They prepared the ground. And their ending is described in a single striking line. The sky burned and the waters turned to powder. Now hold that image, because roughly 250 million years ago, at what geologists call the Permian extinction, the single most catastrophic mass extinction in the entire fossil record occurred. It is, almost literally, a description of what happens to a carbonate-based ocean under catastrophic acidification. A Bronze Age scribe, working with clay and a reed stylus, described a chemical process that modern geochemistry would not document for thousands of years afterward. The second species is called Gunurgal, which translates roughly as great boned form. According to the tablet, they walked across the land that the first species had prepared, fed on vegetation, and their bones were, in the scribe's own words, as the pillars of a temple. Their ending did not come from water or acid. It came, the text says, through fire from the outer darkness, a specific grammatical construction that Sumerian scholars have noted was reserved almost exclusively for events described as originating beyond the sky itself, beyond the ordinary weather and seasons the Sumerians knew. 66 million years ago, a massive impact event, a bolide striking the Earth from space, triggered the extinction that wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs. Fire from the outer darkness. And the species it destroyed in the tablet, enormous plant-eating, bone-pillared landwalkers, bear a resemblance to sauropod dinosaurs that is very difficult to wave away as coincidence. Consider what that phrase actually requires. Fire from the outer darkness is not how a Bronze Age farming society described lightning or grass fire or a volcano. Those events all had their own established vocabulary in Sumerian religious language, tied to gods of storm and weather whose domains were well understood and repeatedly named elsewhere. This phrase sits outside that entire system. It describes something arriving from beyond the sky itself, a category the Sumerians otherwise reserved almost exclusively for the realm of the gods, not for ordinary weather. 2 species down, 2 extinction events matched, described by people who never once laid eyes on a fossilized skeleton. And it only gets stranger from here, because the third entry is where the tablet stops describing individual creatures and starts describing something closer to a civilization. The third species carries the name Ashmagar, a compound that has generated more scholarly disagreement than any other term on the tablet. Broken into its parts, it suggests something like the ones who set the singular law, or the ones bound by one law. Their builders did not. During the late Carboniferous period, atmospheric oxygen levels on Earth reached roughly 35%, dramatically higher than today, and that oxygen-rich air supported arthropods of genuinely enormous size. Dragonflies with wingspans over half a meter, millipedes longer than a man is tall, scorpions the size of house pets. These creatures built extensive burrow systems that have been found across multiple continents. When oxygen levels later collapsed during the transition toward the following geological period, the passive breathing systems these arthropods relied on simply stopped functioning. The breath of the world changed. Their burrows survived as trace fossils. The builders did not. A scribe working millennia before anyone understood atmospheric chemistry described an extinction mechanism that would not be formally modeled by paleontologists until the 20th century, when researchers began reconstructing ancient oxygen levels using isotope analysis the Sumerians could never have imagined. The fourth entry is where the tablet stops feeling abstract and starts feeling personal, because the species it describes sounds unmistakably, almost uncomfortably, familiar. This one is called Lunita Kur, which translates roughly as the near humans of the other land. The physical description here is the most detailed on the entire tablet. They walked upright. They used tools made of stone. They wore the skins of animals. They made sounds that carried meaning but were not, the text specifies, speech. They were stronger than humans, with thicker bones and skulls that sloped where ours are flat. They lived in caves. They buried their dead. And the tablet states plainly that they existed alongside the earliest humans for many counted seasons before disappearing. There is no catastrophe attached to their ending. No fire, no flood, no plague. The tablet simply says the new ones came, and the Lunita Kur grew fewer and fewer until the last of them slept and did not wake. Read that sentence again slowly, because it is doing something none of the previous 3 entries did. It is not describing an environmental disaster at all. It is describing displacement, competition. One population slowly, quietly replacing another over a long stretch of time without a single dramatic event marking the end. That is an oddly restrained way to describe an extinction if the scribe were simply inventing dramatic mythology to entertain an audience. If that description sounds like it is pointing directly at Neanderthals, that is because it lines up with the modern scientific picture in almost every detail available. Genetic sequencing has confirmed that Neanderthals coexisted with modern humans for thousands of years before disappearing. They used stone tools. They wore animal skins. They buried their dead with apparent ritual care. Their skeletons show denser bones and pronounced brow ridges with a sloping shape at the back of the skull instead of the rounded profile modern humans have. And their vocal anatomy likely limited them to communication that carried meaning without producing the full range of modern human speech. Their populations did not vanish in a single event. They declined slowly, region by region, as modern human populations expanded into the same territory, until the very last surviving groups faded out entirely. Here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. Sumerian civilization itself only emerges in the historical record thousands of years after the last Neanderthals disappeared. That is an enormous gap of time, far longer than any confirmed unbroken oral tradition has ever been shown to survive without a writing system to anchor it. And yet this tablet describes a species matching Neanderthal anatomy, behavior, tool use, communication limits, and even the specific gradual pattern of their decline in a level of detail that has no obvious source. Either a Bronze Age scribe invented, purely by coincidence, a description that happens to match a hominin species he could not possibly have known existed, or the information reached him through some chain of transmission that managed to preserve real detail across a length of time that should have erased it completely. Which brings us to the fifth and final entry, the shortest passage on the entire tablet, and by far the most difficult to explain away. This species is named Anshaga, translated as those of the inner heaven. Unlike the first four entries, there is almost no physical description here at all. Instead, the text focuses entirely on what this species could do. They knew the counting of all things. They built structures that moved the stars in their vision. They spoke across distances without sound, and they held what the Sumerians called the me, the sacred laws that governed reality itself, not as gifts handed down from the gods, but as something they had earned through their own understanding. This is the only one of the five species the tablet describes as possessing anything resembling technology. Not simple tools, technology. And its ending is not environmental, it is not geological, it is not atmospheric. The tablet says they reached for the fire of the gods and the fire consumed them. They burned from within. The ground they stood on turned to glass. The water they drank turned to poison. And their children were born malformed for 7 generations, until finally, none were born at all. When the translation team first published this passage, they attached a footnote that has since been cited more than any other line in their entire body of work. In careful, clinical language, that footnote noted that the description was structurally consistent with the known effects of ionizing radiation exposure on a biological population, including acute radiation sickness, environmental vitrification of the ground itself, contamination of the water table, and multi-generational reproductive damage, leading eventually to total reproductive failure. And here's where the story stops living entirely inside a museum and steps into the physical world. Geological surveys conducted in more than one region have documented deposits of fused silica glass embedded in rock strata dating back roughly 4,000 years. This is not ordinary sand fused by lightning or by a meteorite strike. When researchers compared the trace element ratios in this glass to known impact signatures, the closest match was not a natural formation at all. It was trinitite, the strange glass created at the site of the first nuclear weapons test in the 20th century. None of this is being presented as settled proof. Sample sizes are small, the interpretations are contested, and mainstream geology has offered competing natural explanations. But the coincidence, if that is all it is a difficult one to simply dismiss. Of the 5 species described on this single tablet, the Anshaga are the one that resembles us most closely. Technological, mathematical, ambitious, and destroyed, according to the text, not by an outside force at all, but by the direct result of their own achievement. The tablet never states outright whether we are meant to be understood as the same civilization returning, or as an entirely new attempt starting from nothing. It simply records, in careful, structured detail, what happened to the last civilization that reached roughly the same threshold we appear to be approaching right now. Sit with the specific wording of that ending for a moment, because it is far more precise than a generic warning about pride or overreach. The text does not say the gods punished the Anshaga for stealing forbidden knowledge, which is the standard shape of a Sumerian cautionary myth, the kind told about kings who reached too far and were struck down for it. This entry breaks that mold entirely. There is no angry deity delivering judgment. There is only cause and effect. They reached for the fire consumed them. No divine hand is described pulling the trigger. The destruction is presented as a direct mechanical consequence of what they built, not a punishment handed down from outside. That is a strikingly modern way to frame a catastrophe, and it stands completely alone against everything else we know from this civilization's mythology. Step back and look at the full sequence together. Because the pattern is where this story stops being 5 separate curiosities and becomes something much harder to shake. Marine organisms wiped out by catastrophic ocean acidification, massive land animals wiped out by an impact from space, giant collectively behaving arthropods wiped out by an atmospheric oxygen collapse, a near-human species gradually replaced and outcompeted by modern humans, and finally a technological civilization destroyed by a weapon of its own making. 5 extinctions, 5 real events with real evidence in the fossil and geological record. All 5 sitting on one tablet, carved by people who possessed none of the instruments modern scientists needed to discover any of it. One detail has been raised repeatedly by skeptics as a mark against the whole account, and it deserves to be addressed directly rather than ignored. The order on the tablet is not strictly chronological. The atmospheric oxygen collapse that ended the 3rd species actually happened before the acidification event that ended the 1st, not after it, based on the standard geological timeline. Critics have pointed to that discrepancy as evidence the correspondences are simply coincidental pattern matching. But one independent researcher, working through the text a few years ago, proposed a different explanation. She argued the tablet is not organized by when each event happened. It is organized by how complex each species was when it ended. If every species that came before us was eventually wiped out, once it reached a certain level of complexity, what exactly is waiting for us? That researcher had accepted an invitation to present her findings at a conference of European archaeologists. Her paper was formally scheduled, and then, under circumstances that were never publicly explained, it was withdrawn before she ever delivered it. She was not the only person connected to this tablet whose work quietly stopped. The full translation of the complete text was first cited publicly in a science publication that generated a wave of outside attention. Curious readers, amateur researchers, journalists asking follow-up questions the museum clearly did not want to keep answering. Within months of that attention, access to the physical tablet was formally restricted. The stated reason on record was conservation, routine preservation work required for a fragile ancient object. But several details around that explanation resist a simple, routine reading. Standard conservation restrictions almost always limit physical handling of an object, while still keeping its existence and its catalog entry publicly visible and searchable. The modern digital record has been noticeably thinned. More than a decade is an extraordinarily long hold for conservation work on an object this size, especially when the same institution has fully conserved other tablets in far worse physical condition within a fraction of that time. No public status report on the conservation work has ever been issued. Multiple independent researchers, over the following years, and from more than one country, formally requested renewed access to study the tablet further, hoping to re-examine the translation, check it against newly excavated comparison texts, and settle the lingering disagreements over a handful of contested signs. Each request came back declined, using strikingly similar language. The same institutional phrasing applied, oddly, to both this tablet and the one other object from the same collection that scholars consider similarly anomalous. One junior member of the original translation team, speaking off the record years afterward, said only that the institutional response to the tablet's sudden public attention had been, in the person's own words, chilling, and that continuing serious work on the text was unlikely to receive any further institutional support. Those are not the words of a team that believed they had simply translated one more routine Bronze Age creation myth. The scholar who led that original translation effort has published essentially nothing on Sumerian cosmological material since. Their academic output shifted almost entirely toward administrative and economic cuneiform texts, about as far from controversial as the field allows. That shift has never been publicly explained. So where does that leave us? A single tablet describing 5 species that lived and died before humanity ever existed, each ending matched with real, physical evidence from the deep fossil and geological record. Consider the odds involved if this really is nothing more than coincidence. 5 separate descriptions, 5 separate real-world extinction mechanisms, each one requiring specialized modern instruments, isotope analysis, satellite mapping of impact craters, laboratory modeling of ancient atmospheric chemistry, to even confirm in the first place, for a Bronze Age scribe to accidentally land on 5 accurate matches in a row, using nothing but clay, a reed stylus, and whatever tradition had been passed down to him, is not impossible. But it is exactly the kind of improbability that should make any careful researcher stop and look twice before filing the tablet away as just another myth. A pattern too specific, across too many independent details, to comfortably wave off as coincidence, yet still lacking the kind of definitive, unanimous proof that would force the mainstream record to rewrite itself. A research trail that keeps hitting the same wall, quiet withdrawals, unexplained career shifts, records thinned rather than expanded, and a tablet sitting, right now, in restricted storage rather than on public display where anyone could go read it for themselves. The tablet places humanity fifth in line, not at the top of creation, looking down at everything that came before, but as the latest attempt in a cycle that is already repeated 4 times, each attempt ending the moment it crossed a certain threshold of capability. Every species before us rose, however slowly, however strangely, to the outer edge of what its environment would allow, and every single time that edge turned out to be the end. It gives that final threshold a name that should sound uncomfortably familiar to anyone alive right now. Reaching for a kind of fire that consumes the one who reaches for it. The tablet does not tell us whether that fifth ending is a warning, a prophecy, or simply a record of what has always happened, every single time, without exception. It only tells us what came before us, and precisely how each version of what came before us stopped existing. It leaves the sixth ending, ours, completely unwritten. Whether that blank space stays blank, or whether some future scribe eventually fills it in the exact same way the first 5 were filled, is apparently still, for now, entirely up to us. If this changed how you think about what the ancient world actually knew, subscribe, because next week we go back into the same restricted collection for a tablet that describes something even harder to explain.